Good morning, everybody. Eli Perry here again, and we're going to continue our look at the nature and function and effects of propaganda by expanding on yesterday's video about the Woozle effect and the way that it works, and discussing the most impactful historical Woozle event. Yesterday, I talked about a Woozle hunt that I was on regarding the F-35 and how I eventually killed that Woozle. Today, we're going to take a look at a Woozle that's been running around since the mid-12th century and still isn't dead yet, most unfortunately. Because today, we're going to talk about something called the blood libel. For those of you who are not familiar with this, the blood libel is an anti-Semitic canard, a widely believed lie, a Woozle, that got started in the mid-12th century in England. And it is this idea, which has been around ever since then in some quarters, that Jewish people, either at an interval of a certain number of years, usually held to be every 7 years, or simply every year for Passover, murder a Christian child and use that person's blood in the making of matzah bread for the celebration of Passover. Now, this got started in the year 1144, just outside the city of Norwich in England. And it's a particularly interesting and instructive case because we know who person A was. At very least, we know who the first person to write this down and disseminate this to a wide audience was. So at very least, we know the person who first took it from a very small regional phenomenon, a fairly closed informational space, and blew it up into the wider world where it became enormously impactful. So, on or about the 22nd of March, 1144, a 12-year-old apprentice who we now know as William of Norwich was found dead, stabbed, in the forest near the city. Because of two factors. One, the nature of the wounds, which included defensive wounds on the palms of the hands, and the timing. Right near Easter, during the Feast of Easter, which coincides with the Jewish Feast of Passover, the rumor got started that he had been murdered by the local Francophone Jewish community. Now, this idea did not really spread until several years later when a monk named Thomas of Monmouth, a Benedictine who was a member of the Norwich Cathedral Priory, was hired to write a book about the life and the death of young William. Now, in the intervening 8 years between William's death and the writing of this book, he had become, or his relics had become, a sort of local religious tourist attraction. Back in those days, the relics of saints or popular holy people were often, essentially, tourist attractions. People would come to see them, to pray at their shrines for miracles of healing or for whatever you needed. And just as any tourist attraction today, they were important to the local economy. People come in, they spend their money, they hang around for a while, they get drunk, maybe they commit some kind of public order offense and the sheriff can lock them up and fine them. Tourists are important. Just ask any big city in Europe. They're all still trying to figure out how to deal with the same sorts of problems. And they're all still trying to figure out how to make that money. Well, Thomas of Monmouth was a writer who contributed to both to the Peterborough Chronicle, which is a multi-author, multi-century long document, which is a continuation of something called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And the Peterborough Chronicle and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle are the only real historical sources that we have for a number of events, or the only good descriptions we have for a number of events anyway. But more importantly, Thomas wrote a book called The Life and Miracles of St. William of Norwich, which was published in the year 1150. And it was an attempt to make the case for William's being canonized as a saint, because once he was a saint, his relics were official. People could officially come and pray at his reliquary or his shrine. Churches could be built and sanctified in his name, things like that. It would make this tourist attraction level up a little bit. And in order to make the whole thing as lurid as possible, Thomas introduced this idea that the murder had not simply been a murder, but rather that it had been a religious ritual, and that the Jewish community had murdered young William specifically in order to harvest his blood, in order to use it in the baking of religious food, matzah bread for Passover, and also that he had been tortured and crucified in a manner intended to mock the crucifixion of Christ. Remember those defensive wounds on the palms of his hands? Someone's blocking a blow. This is a really common feature of like edged weapon attacks, is wounds to the palms of the hands and the spaces between the fingers. Well, that was interpreted as nail wounds. There was this idea running around at the time that Jewish people knew the truth of Christ, but hated Christ and therefore mocked Christ. One of the other anti-Semitic canards, lies, that went around at the time was that Jewish people routinely stole or attempted to steal the consecrated host from churches, specifically in order to carry out acts of violent desecration and sacrilege. And these wounds on young William's hands were interpreted as another mocking gesture of this kind. Now, at first, this didn't go very far. Most people regarded these sorts of claims as far-fetched. There was a lot of anti-Semitism running around at the time, but, people generally are possessed of a reasonable amount of common sense. And even in the area around Norwich itself, Thomas of Monmouth's claims were never really fully believed. They were a creepy story to scare kids, and that was really about it. But here's the thing. The Jewish community in Western Europe at the time was subject to a number of very strict restrictions on daily life and on their civic and social function. Jewish people, for instance, were required to live in certain parts of cities. They were required to live in the ghetto. They were not allowed to live in the countryside. They were required to wear certain clothing to visibly identify themselves as Jewish. And there was a whole long list of occupations that they were not permitted to engage in. Jewish people could not be apprentices, which meant they could not enter the trades. They were kept out of the guilds, right? They were obviously not allowed to go into any kind of educational career because formal education at that time was controlled by the Catholic Church. Their testimony in court was legally worthless. A Jewish person could not testify in court in any way. They could be questioned for investigative purposes, but when the time came to actually stand up and deliver testimony in court, whether for the prosecution or the defense, even to the point of making an accusation, a Jewish person's word was legally worthless. And what all this meant was that Jewish people tended to be heavily concentrated in what we would consider to be commercial and corporate work. They tended to be heavily involved in land transactions. A lot of the most important land brokers in Britain and France were Jewish. They were, of course, heavily involved in finance because land transactions need to deal in large sums of money or in large quantities of goods for transactions in kind. They were involved in the printing industry, the nascent printing industry. Movable type printing hadn't yet been invented, but there were other sort of niches. Handbill printing, for instance. If you needed a bunch of handbills written out, maybe you got a Jewish person to do that for you, mostly because most Jewish people were literate. But the big one was that Jewish people were forced into a near monopoly on interest-bearing loans. The church at the time did not allow Christians to charge interest on loans. But anybody who's ever worked in finance knows that without interest, loans basically don't happen because interest is the only way for anybody to make a profit doing it. And if people can't make a profit doing something, they generally won't. Interest is also a hedge against the debtor being unable to service the debt. It means that if somebody gets halfway through paying the debt, they haven't just paid half of it. If they're halfway through the term of the note, they've paid a little bit more because they've been paying interest, which means that the lender's loss is not so severe. So if you want business to happen, if you want investment to happen, you need someone to make loans. But without interest, who's going to do that? Easy, the Jewish community. And nobody likes a creditor. Creditors ask for your money. Creditors have a piece of paper with your name on it that says if you don't pay them, they get to take whatever it is you've put up for collateral. If you took out a loan to purchase a house, they get the house. If you took out a loan to start a business, they get your business, or they garnish a certain portion of your profit. Creditors are a pain in everyone's ass. And where things really got interesting for the Jews was the fact that the king had the right to write off debt. So every now and again, the kings, particularly in England and France, would engage in a practice called tallage. And the idea was that they would do two things. Tallage proper was a special tax applied to the Jewish community, sort of at will. So the king needs extra money. Kings don't borrow money. Kings take money. So they would tallage the Jewish community and show up with a bunch of armed men at about 5 o'clock in the morning, demanding a double-digit percentage of the value of everything in the Jewish space, usually in the form of cash. And the king could also do favors for friends by writing off the debts that they owed to Jewish bankers. He could technically do this for debts that anybody owed to anybody, but it's always easier doing that to the hated minority. And so it was politically popular and economically workable, shall we say, although extremely problematic, for kings and rulers to every now and again have a good reason for really coming down on the Jewish community. Couldn't do it all the time, or else they'd go broke, and then you couldn't rob them anymore. But, every few years, a pogrom, a little bit of rape, a little bit of burning things, and a whole lot of stealing. This was something that everybody in the medieval European elite had an interest in because they made money at it. It also had a wonderful propagandistic value in that it got people focused on somebody else to be angry at instead of angry at the king. So if, for instance, the king goes off on a ruinously expensive crusade that eats up all of the country's money, and he then, because he doesn't pay his bills, gets himself thrown in jail in Austria, and his mom and his little brother have to strip the country's economy in order to pay his ransom. I'm looking at you, Richard Lionheart. Well, why would you blame your mother? Especially when she's beautiful and intelligent and popular. And I mean, everybody hates your little brother, but, you know, it's so much easier to blame the Jews. It's so much easier to just trot out old, half-forgotten woozles about ritual murder and then come down like the hammer of God himself, avenging his son and avenging the children of Christian England. And so the blood libel starts to circulate in European societies, essentially as a way to drive an economic activity and as a form of propaganda to get people not quite so angry at the powers that be. And the thing about this is, this remained true for almost 1,000 years. The last pogrom, that is to say, the last incidents of uncontrolled mass public violence against the Jewish community, driven by rumors of ritual murder, occurred in the Russian Empire in 1905. That's 119 years ago. It is possible that there are people today alive in Russia or Ukraine who heard about this murder spree. And we're talking about a murder spree with hundreds of victims in multiple cities across a 6-month period. It's possible that there is someone alive in Russia or Ukraine today who heard about this incident from a grandparent who witnessed it firsthand. They would have witnessed it as a young child, but they might have seen it. The blood libel, this woozle, this unprovable accusation that people believe because of an unverifiable, false chain of informational provenance, which started in the mid-12th century, was causing murders in 1905. And it goes beyond even that. Blood libel accusations were a frequent feature of Nazi propaganda, in particular in the lurid tabloid called Der Stürmer, which was published by Julius Streicher. Now, it's important to note that the luridness of Der Stürmer was so over the top, so ridiculous, that no less a Nazi personality than Hermann Goering forbade Luftwaffe personnel from reading it. But it was very widely disseminated among the German population in general and among the SS in particular. This was the sort of thing that was widely believed within the parts of German society which were most responsible for the horrors of the Holocaust. Here's the thing. This is still around. It doesn't take a whole lot of poking around on the internet to find websites that still insist that this practice takes place. In the late 1990s, I was active on a web forum. You younger folks don't know what those are, but think of them as like standalone subreddits. I was active on a web forum called Ireland Uncensored. And mostly this was a place for people to argue very loudly and in highly insulting language about the situation in Northern Ireland. But there was a prolific poster on there who went by the handle Brian Kay. He professed to be an elderly American living in the state of Colorado who was on a one-man crusade to save Ireland from international Anglo-Jewish domination. My first real encounter with a conspiracy nut outside of my own family. And one of the things that he would bang on and on and on about was the blood libel. He absolutely insisted that it was true. One of his favorite sort of anti-Semitic, anti-British tirades was to accuse, or rather to state, that every incident of an Irish child being killed by accident or by design, by terrorists, by soldiers, in car accidents even, was a result of this person being murdered by Anglo-Jewish blood-drinking vampire. I don't know. My point is that in 1998, these ideas were still around. You still see them and hear them today if you look hard enough, and you don't have to look very hard. The blood libel was, at least until recently, I have not yet verified if this is currently true, but the blood libel was taught as fact in school textbooks in Saudi Arabia and in some of the Palestinian areas of Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza, etc., etc., etc. This idea is still out there. It's still getting people killed today. And this fucking woozle's been running around for almost 800 years. All right, that's going to be it for today, folks. Thanks very much. I appreciate everybody tuning in, and I hate the idea that I've developed a catchphrase, but I think it's an important thing. Don't trust but verify. Just verify. See ya.